Recording now. All right. So again, welcome to Data Equity. Today is the Talking Data Equity. Today is the 5th of February. And in terms of a very non-scientific poll about who is here, what sectors, and again, a big thanks to the folks who suggested this poll. It's a great addition to Talking Data Equity. We have a lot of people here from the nonprofit sector and the public and government sector. Nice turnout from the corporate sector, academia, small business at 1%, and then others not mentioned here. And feel free to put it in the chat if you like. One of the reasons, oh, I'm not sharing results. Yeah, sorry. I'm new to Zoom polls. So thank you very much. They flashed and they went away. Can you see them now? Yes. Okay, great. Fabulous. Great. Excellent. So here are the poll results. And one of the reasons you can put your sector in the chat, if it's not one of these sectors, is it will help us add that category to this question the next time we ask it. And in terms of people that are interested in particular areas, we have, I think the biggest number I see there is 25% of people interested in public policy, a lot of people from the various education sectors, disability sector, medicine, that's great, mental health. And oh yes, somebody's saying gender-based violence could be added here. That's a great addition. There are so many specifics. And frankly, that's the maximum number of options you're allowed to have on a Zoom poll. So we'll ask different questions every Friday. It's just a way for us to kind of get to know who's here, who's in the room. And as I mentioned last Friday, some of these weeks, we will have a specific topic or a specific sector or a specific kind of area that we'll talk about. And some of these weeks we're having guests, and I'm just about to kind of announce the guest list. We are incredibly in shock at some of the guests who said, yes, they would come. A lot of you have been suggesting guests, which is great. If you still want to suggest a guest, there's that opportunity is never going to go away. There's the link where you can submit who you'd like to have as a guest. And we are shocked at the number of people that you're suggesting that are saying yes. So we're very excited to announce our guests. And what we're going to talk about this week, today, as promised last week, is social identity data or demographics, because that is a very, very important area in terms of data equity. And one of the topics that over half of the questions that you folks submitted deal with, which means we should pay attention to social identity data. Okay, so in terms of where to start today for social identity data, we're going to try and kind of do a balance of getting to the questions that you submitted and getting to questions that are coming from the live people here in the room, the Zoom room today. And the first question that somebody submitted is how, let me read this, how do we know when collecting gender identity data whether we should include one or two categories and have a big enough sample size, or whether we should include many different categories at the risk of having a small sample size? So this is really kind of one of the fundamental questions in terms of collecting social identity data. And there are a couple of ways to answer this question. The first and most important thing to know before you're collecting any social identity data is, why are you collecting the social identity data? The reason for collecting social identity data is one of the main drivers for what decisions, what choices you should make. I'm just putting in the chat and a link that you can read on later about how important it is to figure out why you're trying to collect social identity data, because without that, we will never know what you should include. The second question that you'll need to answer in terms of trying to figure out whether you should include many categories or few categories is directly related to who's getting to make the decisions about this. Who is it that is actually in a position of power to decide what categories are going to exist in the data equity collection? And then the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm going to open it up to a question from you folks, is deciding beforehand what you're going to do with the various categories of people whose data you've collected is really important, because when you're collecting social identity data, which is really personal data about individuals, when you're collecting that data, it's a social contract. You are making a deal. You are asking someone to trust you. And part of that deal, that social contract, that trust needs to be based on you being very transparent about exactly what you're going to do with that data before you even ask them for it. And that's the most important thing about figuring out what categories you're going to include when you collect social identity data. Even more important than the actual categories is the transparency around why you're using those categories and what you're going to do with that data. Okay, so that's one question from the question box. So now I want to take a question from you folks. So what is it that you are wondering about in terms of way to collect social identity data, use social identity data, an example of something that you're struggling with or needing to make a decision about now? Excellent. Go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, so when you put out the question about why are you collecting social identity data, the first thing that popped in my head was, well, because the funders make us and give us specific categories often even. But I was remembering last week in putting in that statement of like, these demographics reflect the US Census Bureau's categories based on funder requirements or something like that. And that being a way to kind of push back, make aware, but at the same time, I wonder how much agency should we look at within our own internal selves to making those decisions about categories and why we're collecting social data and social identity data and such as well.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. I'll give you my ideas about this, but if anybody else wants to share their ideas or their experience, feel free to raise your hand or also put it into the chat. I would say yes, that to the question, first of all, thank you for your honesty. The vast majority of people who are collecting social identity data are doing so because somebody else is requiring them to do that. I take a lot of polls in a lot of sectors about this, from the corporate sector to the nonprofit sector and everything in between. And mostly it is largely driven externally. And that is a really important thing to know about yourselves and about all this data that exists. And the second thing is that if you are going to collect it, I would suggest that it is a worthwhile conversation to have amongst your team about, okay, we have to collect this data because of these external requirements. Are we also going to collect this data in alignment with some of our own equity goals and harness the power of the the information, the valuable information that we're asking people to share with us? Or are we simply only going to collect it for funding? And there isn't, I would really want to emphasize, there isn't a single right answer to that. Like it's not a terrible thing to just say we're collecting this because the funder is making us. That's not a mark of shame. It's just really important to have the conversation internally and say, do we have any internal uses or needs for collecting social identity data? And one of the reasons that's worth your time, because nobody here is looking for what to do with their many extra hours, and is that oftentimes the requests for social identity data, specifically about the categories or the way that that data is used, those external requests are open to feedback, are malleable. That is, I would say, the number one thing that I have learned working with many different organizations with Wheel Count, is that the requests for social identity data is almost always open to change if you can give a reason. If you can say, hey, we're trying to collect race data or income data or the experience of poverty data or gender identity data in order to fulfill your requirement. But we've figured out that A, that data doesn't reflect our community, and B, we could actually make a lot more usefulness out of the data if we collected it in this different way. Accompanied by a narrative that's like that, I have been shocked at the number of external folks that are willing to be malleable about that. And that's especially true, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, if we do it as a group. That if the same funder or the same accreditation agency or the same institute of whatever gets that feedback repeatedly from a variety of different people, it has a much bigger chance to move the needle. Yeah. It's a similar question here in the chat, which is, we often need to default to the census. This is, I think, the United States Census. I'm not sure. It doesn't say in the question, but let's just say the United States Census, and that's not inclusive. How do we challenge this, and what have others done? So happy to hear anybody who wants to raise their hand and say some of the ways that they've challenged it. But yeah, I would recommend challenging it by always saying in your reporting why you're collecting the data categories that you have, and also B, consider collecting it in a way that's suitable to you, and then reporting it as close as possible to align to the census. There's often ways to work as a community to collect more nuanced, more specific data than what you're required to, that then can be aggregated to kind of match the non-inclusive census data. Not perfectly, but it's never perfect. Okay, I'm gonna, oh, great. Go ahead and unmute. Hi, how are you?
There. Good, coming from the city of Vancouver, where we actually launched a UN Safe City survey, and we've purposefully provided multiple gender identity categories. And even with some other work I've done on some survey design for advisory bodies, same thing, adding more options than what our Canadian census would give. And then we also did the work of comparing the kind of the survey results to the census. I mean, the first question is it necessary to compare? Because the UN survey was kind of about perceptions of safety and understanding the locations across Vancouver where LGBTQ, AAI plus, and Two-Spirit folk were feeling unsafe compared to their straight hetero counterparts. And our municipal police data surveys that come out are all like, middle-aged white women saying they feel pretty safe in Vancouver. And Vancouver's pretty safe comparatively speaking. But, thinking about some of those key factors and demographics and then saying, oh, Vancouver feels safe, is clearly a big flaw in the way our local police department reports out. So we wanted to kind of open that narrative and kind of challenge it. So in showing multiple gender identity categories and then comparing it to the census, we kind of show the limitations with our current census, which the Canadian federal government is aware of, which is why in the 2021 census, we'll see more gender identity categories. So I think we should still do multiple categories, but as you've mentioned, it's like, what are you doing? What is the main purpose? What are the research questions? And that can help inform your decision when you're asking demographic data. For us, it was about understanding how demographic variables may or may not affect perceptual outcomes or reasons of being on an advisory body, or perceptions of safety and experiences of gender-based violence, assault, and discrimination. So that's a great way to show the limitations, show why you're doing what you're doing and why you're asking, and really kind of beginning to challenge those other standardized processes. In this case, with the UN Safe City Survey, we actually, I didn't design it, but there was a flaw in the ethnic racialized category, because it was, just like South Asian, like just lumping in a bunch of nationalities and ethnicities and ancestries. So that was the flaw compared to the focus of gender identity, which was much stronger. So I think that's how we decided to do that, for better or for worse.
That is a great example. Thank you so much for sharing that example, and also for ending it with for better or worse, because that is always the reality, right? Like when we are collecting data about social identity data, there are always going to be pros and cons, right? We're never going to capture a fully inclusive data point that reflects an individual, unless we're doing qualitative data work, because everybody is going to have a very unique set of social identities that are very intersectional. And so to figure out how to weigh those pros and cons, like you're saying, for better or worse, it's essential that we kind of figure out what it is we're trying to do. And it's really interesting to me that it was did you say UN safe cities? So this was beyond just Canada?
So yeah, the status of women department at the federal level have been encouraging municipalities to take on the UN Safe Cities Initiative, which is a global initiative to understand safety. Many municipalities across Canada interpreted that differently, even though the focus is meant to be on women. So we centered the perspectives around women, but also the LGBTQ plus 2S community, the Two-Spirit community. And Edmonton, for instance, focused on seniors, which is, valid, but it's really kind of asking what's the point, who in the city may be most disadvantaged and may feel most unsafe, because that has clear implications in terms of like your hierarchy of needs, and then actually creating a ladder of prosperity to get people out of situations or to have a more prosperous socioeconomic society. So yeah, we went with that, and it's still ongoing as we speak.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. And Chris is hopping in to say that there's a long description, a great detail about how they're going to, oh, that's great. So Chris is saying, I think that the Canadian census describes in great detail how they plan to combine data categories if needed. It's all online and pretty interesting. It's transparent in that they explain the process, but may not be accessible in terms of language or jargon. Oh, that's great. Well, that's fantastic news. Yay, Canadian census. And we will look into that for sure and link that to the resources on our forum. And maybe if it's too hard to understand, we or somebody, one of our colleagues can write a kind of a translation because we really find that the way to move the needle is best practices. And also, speaking of moving the needle, Mindy in the chat about 8 minutes ago has written out a great example about a success story in mental health programs, statewide agency in CA. So I assume that that might be California in the United States. And that is a huge success story. And it looks like they're actually maybe in their attempt to change and make more equitable the way that they collect data are actually influencing laws, which is like so cool, and shows the power of not just kind of accepting for forever non-inclusive social identity categories or social identity categories that don't reflect the needs of your group of people. That is fantastic. Okay. There is another question that is a private question that I will amplify here that said, last week we started to talk about mixed race categories. That's true, we did. And the group of people who identify as mixed race is becoming larger. Wondering how to collect this information better so that people feel like we are respectful of their identity, but also to have manageable subsets of data. I was just talking with someone yesterday who said the person I was talking to identified as a Black person, and their domestic partner identifies as a white person. So their children show up in so many different ways in data sets. And they said, you know, it's just illustrating for us that we have a problem when we're not specific about it. Like they don't even know, like when their school district sends home a report that says, you know, this is the graduation rate of Black students, this is the graduation rate of white students. They don't know where to look to see how the school district is serving students like their kids because they don't know how their kids have been sorted. So this is a very, very important question. So again, I'll just reiterate this link here is our kind of our plea for all agencies that are reporting on data that you always say what you did. There's no one right thing, that you should always do this with somebody who has more than one racial or ethnic identity. But the one thing that you should do is say what you did. So there's no recipe for this is how to do it equitably. You should always combine the data in this way or aggregate in this data. But what you should always do is say what you did so that people, you know, who want to see how their school district is serving children like theirs know where to look. Which of course is very vulnerable. There's always a risk because not everyone's going to like the way that you're combining or aggregating or dealing with data from people who have more than one racial or ethnic identity. Does anyone else, I mean, I can talk for days about what I think people should do with this data and how you should collect data from individuals who are more than one racial background. And I agree very much when you say this group of people is becoming larger, especially in Canada and especially in the United States, where race data is operationalized a lot. One thing I'll say here, this is, I think, the last links that I'll share to our blog posts, is that one of the things about collecting race data and not being sure what to do about people with more than one racial heritage is stop and ask why we're collecting race data anyways. Because frequently in our very well-intentioned, very well-resourced, very well-educated attempts to use data to understand equity, to use data to kind of reduce racism or reduce gaps in access and opportunities, the first thing that we do is say, please raise your hand if you're a person of color, which is really, if you think about that, not necessarily a great plan. And that oftentimes we're trying to understand the experience of racism or some other lived experience that might be related to race, but is not in any way actually race. And so then to ask somebody what their racial background is, and then make thereby a whole bunch of assumptions about their lived experiences based on what racial identity box they check, kind of sounds like racism. So, Stacy, hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great.
We've talked a lot about collecting data from individuals. We also, I work for a foundation. We collect data from organizations as well. So are there other things to think about when we ask organizations the populations that they serve? And one of the things that sometimes we have trouble figuring out is like, do you serve the general population? And that may or may not be diverse people. It may or may not purposefully, like the organization may or may not purposefully be serving a specific population of people, or like who the program is designed for. And we're having a lot of like debates about like how to collect that information. Any thoughts?
Muted to start with. I'm muted. So again, I'm going to hop in with my ideas, but any of you who want to hop in with your ideas, do so in the chat or raise your hand. This is such a good point. This is such a good question, because the first thing I would suggest is try and get even more specific about what it is you're trying to understand. Are you trying to understand if an agency is accessible to a diverse group of people? Are you trying to understand if an organization that is attempting to just serve the community, just get a sense of who's using their services? Or are you trying to get an understanding of whether the community itself feels like it has access to the services that it needs? And those are really different questions that require the collection of really different social identity data, because one of the biggest traps we can fall into in trying to collect social identity data to understand if there is equity in kind of service use is to collect social identity data and then kind of compare it to maybe the census data in that community and identify differences as gaps, to say, you know, X% of this community is this ethnic background, this agency is serving only X%, and that difference, that disproportionality, is an equity gap. And the problem with that, of course, is that it centers our beliefs, like an external person's belief about what a person from a certain racial or ethnic background should do or should want. And so what we really probably want to understand in that situation, and this situation may not be yours, but in that situation, what you'd want to do is, rather than ask agencies to collect data, ask the community itself whether it feels like it has access to the services that it needs. Often satisfaction data broken out by racial identity is much more useful than attendance data. That's one thing I'll say. Chris is saying something super awesome and different in the chat, which is, we are piloting asking the question, this is the question, to which category do you most closely identify with? And then they give the options that reflect the Canadian census questions, which of course would also work with the American census questions. And then asking if there's a second category that you identify with. This is stemmed from the fact that our data collection does not always allow us to select all that apply, which is horrible, but all we have. That's a really, really good idea. So what she's saying is that they're essentially kind of asking a race or ethnic identity question 2 times. Not a select all, but a select one, and they're asking it twice. That's a cool idea.
And just, I'm sorry, I broke the rules. I forgot how many people were in here, but like, it's
No, don't worry about it. You go.
It's also helping us understand then, like, so in the example of the person that you get, like you mentioned, so if somebody is half Chinese and half Korean, they can list which of those which of those identities maybe they embrace more. And so that's what we're hoping then to see. So they, like, in a sense, the participant gets to choose which category they fall under, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that that would be particularly interesting to see if you could ask them. I mean, I'm not making a recommendation to you specifically, but the identity that a person most strongly identifies with is going to change depending on what topic we're in. Are we talking about what music they like, what laws they support, how safe they feel in their community? You know, there's so many different contexts in which I or any other human like fronts is like has a negative connotation, but like sees themselves primarily as a different identity. So I'd be really interested to see how that changes, depending on what context that's in. Maybe that could target the issue, but what if I consider myself 100% of both ethnicities? Absolutely. I mean, that is correct. Yes. What if you are 100% of both ethnicities? What would be, if anybody here wants to answer this question, if you do consider yourself 100% of both identities, what would be your first choice of how somebody collecting your data to say, understand the services that you're using in your community? That is a very northern Western construct that simply doesn't exist in other cultures. Totally agree. Very much agree that the whole construct of like choose a race or be parts. Yeah. So is an option to that where instead of asking somebody to consider which identity they're most closely related to or which ethnicity, is one option to allow somebody to select all that apply and then simply count that person 100% in all of the races and ethnicities that they opted for? One of the ways that we would know what to do in these situations, whether we should allow somebody to check lots of boxes, check one, and then how we would analyze that data. The only way to get an answer to that for your project is to go back to why you're collecting the data. If you don't have an answer available to why you need somebody's racial or ethnic identity data, then you're probably not in a good position to ask the racial identity data. And if you do have an answer, then that answer can probably help you figure out. Okay, Danielle, go ahead.
Hi, yes, I don't want, not to like switch the topic, but I have a separate question, if that's okay.
Of course.
I'm wondering if anybody is aware of, so I have, we have multiple conversations about the challenges and how do we make it work and how do we fit into these molds, but is anybody aware of any, I don't know whether it's legislation or action to kind of shift from these standards, like the lumping, Asians into one category, or is there any initiatives, that we may be able to band together or to look into to kind of change some of these standard norms? We're all admitting that these are problematic and they don't work for multiple reasons. So maybe not.
Yes, absolutely. That is what we are doing right here, right now, this hour. You have found it. We are all definitely working to kind of understand the power structures that exist around the expectations and the requirements and the norms of how data collection should be done, can be done, is being done, and how we can embed as much equity in that as possible. And that will absolutely involve changing power structures. Absolutely. But if anybody else has specific instances that they want to talk about. Ernesto, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm hearing a lot of great points in terms of potential solutions for, how do we address the growing multi-ethnicity aspect of individuals and multiracial. At the same time, I wonder, even though this seems like an amazing group of people, it's my first time here and I'm really excited to be here. How much of this conversation should be kept with people who do research and who work in evaluation without having maybe thought leaders in those communities come in to educate us about how they would prefer to be identified. So for example, like, as someone who is Latino, I have struggled with the question about race and ethnicity oftentimes because I know that I saw this in the comment box earlier. With Latino individuals, we don't necessarily fully identify with one race or the other necessarily, especially for individuals who are born and raised in Latin America. The concept of race wasn't something that was very clear to me until I moved to the United States around 9 years ago. So I think it's important to, while we are having these conversations as academics and researchers and people who work in this field, it's also important to make space for thought leaders in those communities who want to give their feedback, because it's no one's job to represent their community. No community is a monolith. So just going to the one person in your staff who is like a person of color or a person of a different sexuality, that's not what I'm talking about. It's communicating with people who want to have those conversations, who are part of the community that we're trying to work with as well. So just making space for that.
Absolutely, could not agree with you more. And there are actually quite a number of those people here today and very active in this community, in the community of We All Count, because absolutely the number one question when collecting social identity is, why are we doing it? And then the number two question is, who gets to be in charge of putting out the boxes that we're expecting people to sort themselves into? And the closer the answer to who gets to put out the boxes, the closer the answer is to the people who are sorting themselves into boxes, the more equitable the work is. And so I absolutely 100% agree that that question, who gets to put out the boxes, who gets to make those decisions, and whose voice gets heard, in that conversation is absolutely critical. And I'm so, so happy that, that you raised it. And I think one of the questions that's coming into the chat is, how can we do this more effectively? Like, one of the common frustrations I see people now putting into the chat is, we really want to do this. And we either have funders or accreditation bodies or external bodies that are dictating to us what we have to do. How do we handle that? Or how do we combine that with our desire to also collect data in a way that's centered and actually led by the communities we serve? And so what we're trying to do here is to share as many success stories and also failure stories and resources that can help people do exactly that. And absolutely, somebody is saying in the chat, it always comes back to focusing on why we're collecting it. And absolutely, I will point out that there are several people here today joining us that are not doing work in the United States, that don't live in the United States or Canada. And this is a very United States, Canada conversation when we get to race. The social identity issue is pretty much universal, but the little race component of social identity has a very specific kind of United States, Canadian element to it. When we do work in, like, we're working with people in other countries, the social identity data that are most salient or most important in order to embed equity in those cases are different types of social identity data. Yeah. Excellent. Very fantastic sharing of ideas and resources in the chat. I think most of them are visible to all of you, so I won't read them all. Yes. Yeah. All right. So we have a few minutes left. Does anybody else who's here live want to unmute themselves and ask a question? Or share a resource or share an example? Okay. I will take this question. Somebody just said, can we have a Dropbox where articles are shared? So let me actually answer that question for you. What we're doing, and actually this is just launching today as we speak, is that we all count in response to continual requests for, like, how can we share ideas? How can we share resources? Can we have a Dropbox article? We have just launched a forum. And in the forum is an unlimited space to share resources and articles and things like that. So if eventually the Talking Data Equity Friday event will have its own little space in the forum, but for now, feel free to share your resources, share ideas, ask questions. The reason that we created a forum instead of using Dropbox or Facebook or Slack or the various things that we have experimented with in the past is that we really needed a place that doesn't harvest your data and is entirely ad-free. And so the purpose of this forum is to give you folks a space to kind of continue the conversations that we have on Fridays, share resources, ask questions of us, ask questions of each other, and without feeling like your data is going to be harvested, or somebody's going to serve you up ads either on that forum, or you're going to see ads related to your activity on the forum somewhere else. So feel free to link all of the resources that you're sharing today on that forum. We'll also do our best to link things on that forum. We'll have a more official introduction to the forum later, but since I saw that people were asking for where can we share these on various platforms. There we go. Oh, Somebody is asking a great question, which I'm very, very happy that you're asking. What are the thoughts on Latinx, Latino, Latina in data collection? I get this a lot. Also in terms of Indigenous people, Aboriginal people, First Nations people, American Indian people. And the question is very much what Ernesto is saying. The most important way to decide what actual names or labels to use is to ask the people who you will be labeling. That's the number one best way to get that answer. And of course, there isn't going to be one answer. Everybody who even shares an identity doesn't want the same labels. There are very different opinions. So again, it all comes back to the same thing. You do your best to kind of connect with the actual humans that I'm going to be labeling. And then I be transparent on my data collection tool and on my reporting of the data from the data collection tool, why I decided on those terms, why I use those categories. Transparency about who is empowered to make these decisions is the heart of data equity. It's important, like what names and labels and boxes we use are important, but the actual heart is transparency around the power dynamics, around who is getting to make these decisions and why. Yes. All right. Yes, another thing, somebody is sending me a direct message, and I very much agree. The other thing that's critical in terms of using these labels and using these boxes is to include actual feedback loops, not just performative feedback loops, but actual feedback loops, so that the people that you're asking to sort themselves out into boxes, because that's basically what we're doing when we're collecting social identity data. We're saying, here's boxes. Please sort yourself into these boxes, is to actually find out how people felt about those boxes. Yeah. Yes. Anyone else want to unmute themselves and kind of have the last word in today's event? While you're waiting to decide if you want to unmute yourself, I will say that it causes me great sadness that we will not be having Talking Data Equity next Friday, because I have a prior commitment. So we will not have this gathering next Friday, which is March, let me see, get this right, March 4th. Feel free to use the forum, feel free to ask questions. We will be back at noon on Friday, March 11th. And before then, between now and Friday, March 11th, I'll be sharing with all of you a little bit of a list of the topics that we tend to that we plan to cover each week, the guests that we have lined up each week. And I'm also going to continue to ask for your feedback. What topics do you want us to prioritize? What guests do you want to see? And yes, okay. What does the map behind me say? So the posters behind me are part of an annual We All Count poster drop. Can you put the Society 6 link in the chat? We're gonna put a link to the chat, because these are actually 2 years ago, our posters. Our creative team makes us some posters every year, but the one that you're asking about says, the maps only show people that aren't invisible to the makers, which I very much love. The red one says, don't tell me what the data says. The data says, and then there's a bad word. The data says bleep. You say. That's the red one. And then the white one says, algorithms are like bacteria. Sure, they can make yogurt, but they also can kill you. Please be careful. So those are last year's, and if you want to see this year's, which we haven't had a chance to get printed and put up, they're in the link that that Society, the Society 6 link, yeah, which, sorry, it's going in the private chat. Let me put it in the public chat. And we do sell these posters, but we do not sell these posters for our own profit, because that would be embarrassing to us. We donate both the gross and the net income from selling these posters to mutual care societies that are based and led by people in various communities. And you can buy knowing that your money is not going to support us. It's not a merch thing, but it's actually going to support mutual aid and mutual care initiatives globally. And there's always a little link to which one this month is going to. Okay, well, this is absolutely the best part of my Friday. Have to go do something else. I apologize if you're the person that's meeting me at 1. You're also important. But thank you for joining. Again, we won't be here next week. We will be here in 2 weeks, which is Friday, March 11th. And you will be hearing from us before that with some updates on specific topics and specific speakers. And feel free to provide us with feedback. Again, we do this to try and curate a useful conversation amongst people who are working to align their data work with their equity work. And if there's anything that we can do to make it more useful, we really do want to hear that, because the whole purpose of this hour is usefulness. Thank you so much for your feedbacks. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.